wise man came to the court to urge the king to reconsider, arguing that the risks of such a venture offset the advantages. My lord, you are preparing to fight against men who dress in leather, both breeches and everything else. So rough is their country that they eat as much as they have, never as much as they want. They drink no wine, but only water. They have no good things at all, not even figs for dessert. business documents found in Mesopotamia, private letters written by Egyptians, and the words of Israelite priests and prophets that have come down through the Old Testament. There are also some non-written sources, archaeological evidence deduced from pottery types and building foundations, and from tools and weapons. Sometimes such materials tell the historian more than he can learn from words. Most important of all, however, are the Greek histories. Despite the techniques of modern archaeology, little more significant information about the Persian Empire is available today than was familiar to any intelligent, concerned citizen of ancient Athens who went to the marketplace to hear read aloud Herodotus's history of the Persian Wars, or chapters from Thucydides, Xenophon, and Ctesias, all of whom also wrote extensively about the Persians. Had not the birth of true written history coincided with the rise of the empire, modern scholars would still be at a loss to place this remarkable people in their world context. Indeed, the relationship of mainland Greece and the Greek colonies of North Africa and Asia Minor to the history of Persia was an intimate one. During the period of Persian ascendancy, the tide of Greek civilization was rising fast. Greek traders were the Persians' most effective mercantile rivals, one fact that led to the war between Persia and the Greek city-states and resulted in the ultimate defeat of the empire. Arising from that bitter conflict of interests, the bias of the Greek scribes who wrote about Persia is often noticeable, and the modern reader must make allowances for it. But for all that, the corpus of Greek histories written during and after the great flowering of Greek civilization remains at the core of most current understanding of the Persians. Only in the matter of the Persians' origins has important new material come to light since ancient times. Knowledge of where the Persians came from, or how they reached the southwestern corner of the Iranian plateau, has been pieced together from the study of ancient languages, from archaeological evidence, and from recently exhumed and translated. Reference is found in the records of other kingdoms. Now on the right here we have a map of the vast and complex Persian Empire. Here is the Mediterranean Sea. To the south we have Libya and Egypt. This is Memphis on the Nile Delta. And then we have the Red Sea. Here is Arabia. Further to the north we have Macedonia, the Black Sea. And over to the right we have the Caspian Sea, the Aral Sea. This is Bactria, Parthia, Caspia. Further south we have the Persian Gulf, Persia itself, Persepolis. Here is Babylon, Babylonia, Assyria. And then the Arabian Sea. North of the Arabian Sea is India. And at the top, the Scythians. nations of the ancient Middle East into a single political unit. Within this 2,600-mile expanse, which is the shaded area that I'm just tracing with my finger, lay the towering Alberts and Sakharos mountains, the fertile valley between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers and the metal-rich hills of Asia Minor. Achaemenid hegemony reached its peak after 522 BC under Darius I. The empire's nucleus had been formed by earlier Achaemenids, who from a base in the region called Persia, laid claim to such ancient kingdoms as Media and Assyria. Cyrus the Great created the actual imperial structure and extended his control to all the land between Bactria and Phrygia. His successor, Cambyses II, absorbed Egypt, and then Darius pushed Persian dominance to its limits. By the end of his reign, the 1,600-mile-long royal road connecting the imperial centre at Susa with Sardis in Lydia was completed, as was the canal that joined the Mediterranean with the Red Sea. The Greek chronicler Herodotus mentioned 28 regions that figured in Persian history. 20 of these were satrapias, or subject states. Scholars have also identified 23 cities and archaeological sites within the Achaemenids' domain. Scholars are thus fairly sure that the Persians were part of a tribal family known as the Iranians, who were members of a still larger group called the Aryans, a scattered assemblage of nomadic tribes whose original homeland was probably the Eurasian plains of southern Russia. Sometime between 2000 and 1800 BC, the Aryans began to migrate. Some moved to the Indian subcontinent, others turned westwards through Iran and penetrated as far as northern Mesopotamia and Syria. About 1400 BC, a third group of Aryans, which included the Persians, moved into Iran from the northeast and gradually moved west. The Iranian plateau they settled on, which Cyrus later praised for the rigorous life it imposed on its inhabitants, is dominated by a ring of rugged mountains, many rising more than 12,000 feet. They surround a central depression of salt deserts that is one of the driest and most unwelcoming regions on the face of the earth. Only in the valleys of the mountain folds or on the plains adjacent to the plateau could substantial numbers of people exist. Extremely hot in summer, sometimes brutally cold in winter, the land was barely suitable for herding. Journeying west, the Iranian tribes made their way across the plateau, skirting the Alberts mountains that form its northern edge, and then turned southeast along the Zagros range that separates the plateau from the long-settled, thickly populated, fertile plains of Mesopotamia. In their progress, the Iranians shoved out or took over indigenous tribes such as the Guti and Lulubi, who had lived in the Zagros for centuries. The newcomers jostled with one another for the choicest territories, stayed for a while, moved on, and settled again. masters, later as their leading vassals. This historic westward movement was not so much arrested by the physical barrier of the Zagros as by what lay beyond, a civilized world of established states with centuries, in some cases millennia, of cultural, political and military tradition. Northeast of the Zagros Mountains, in the lands around Turkey's Lake Van and Iran's Lake Urmia, was Urartu, a relatively young but vigorous state. Below Urartu, and on the western edges of the Zagros in modern Iraq, was the empire of the Assyrians. Still farther south was Babylonia, whose capital, Babylon, was the commercial centre of that world. Below Babylonia, at the head of the Persian Gulf, was Elam, with its centre at Susa, a fading, once brilliant civilization, already 2,000 years old. Looking for lands not controlled by any of these long-established peoples, the Medes finally occupied the wide and fertile plain of present-day Hamadan, in the northwest corner of the Iranian plateau. The Persians, taking somewhat longer to find a place to their liking, seem to have made several tentative settlements before arriving at the southwestern edge of the plateau and choosing weakly occupied territory in the mountainous backcountry of Elam. There, the Persians ceased their wandering long enough to put down roots and absorb much of the Elamite culture and territory. Meanwhile, the fountainhead of that culture, ancient Elam, awaited its doom. By the latter half of the 8th century BC, the Assyrians, now the dominant power in the Middle East, had smashed the stubborn resistance of Urartu, brought Babylonia to submission, overcome the small kingdom of Canaan, and conquered Egypt. About 640 BC, the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal put a violent end to what remained of independent Elam. He boasted that he transformed the land into a wilderness and dragged back to Assyria not only the captive people and cattle, but the bones of Elam's dead kings. His claims of population slain, often amounting to genocide, seem not to have been exaggerated. The former Elamite lands settled by the Persians were apparently too remote and too poor, like the Persians themselves, to attract the worst furies of the Assyrian onslaught. But clashes between Assyrians and Medes grew more and more frequent, and references to the distant Medes and the mighty Medes of the east show up in Assyrian annals with increasing frequency, usually as opponents worthy of respect. The Assyrians were impressed to find Medes not only in the Zagros Mountains, but as far east as they could push on to the plateau. Medes fought from horseback, and from them the Assyrians learned the use of cavalry. Until then, chariots had been their only shock force, and thereafter many of their expeditions against the Medes were for the purpose of acquiring horses. For their part, the Medes were learning from the Assyrians the fundamentals of political organisation. To defend themselves, the Median tribes united, forming by about 670 BC a state under a single king. Assyrian power diminished during the late 7th century BC, partly because unceasing warfare had sapped their reserves of manpower. With the pressure off, the Medes began building an empire of their own, and among the peoples on whom they imposed their sovereignty were the Persians. Now, the photograph on the right shows a landscape anxious to have the adversaries settle matters and thus restore opportunities for profitable Anatolian trade, which the long war had interrupted, Medea and Lydia accepted the 700-mile-long river Halys as the dividing line between their kingdoms. Finally, Ceraxes' son, Astyages, sealed the treaty by marrying the daughter of the Lydian monarch. For the next 3 decades, the ancient Middle East experienced a rare period of stability. Nebuchadnezzar grew nervous enough about the ambitions of the Iranians to erect a chain of fortifications called the Median Wall along the northern border, stretching from the Tigris to the Euphrates, but basically the power balance among Medea, Babylonia and Lydia held fast. In long retrospect, it almost appears that this peaceful interlude in the Middle East was a necessary intermission before the main act, the rise of Persian power. In developing that force was to engulf Medes, Lydians, Babylonians, and eventually even the mighty Egyptians. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there. I hope you enjoyed that small introduction to the Persians. This has been Kate at the Library of Whispers